Hi everyone, welcome back to our third Fireside chat with Relief Syria. My name is Lara and I'm one of the founding members of Relief Syria along with John. And today we'll be having a discussion with Dr. Edmund Ghareeb, a leading scholar and researcher in the field of Middle Eastern studies. Relief Syria is a grassroots initiative created to share information and spread awareness about the ongoing effects of the sanctions enacted on Syria and its people and the consequences that have developed as a result of a decade of conflict, economic downturn, and an unprecedented pandemic. Relief Syria aims to advocate for Syrians' inalienable right to live fulfilled and dignified lives in their homeland, specifically as it relates to economic opportunity. So now I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Edmund Ghareeb. Thank you so much for being here today. Of course, originally from Lebanon, Edmund Ghareeb is a widely renowned researcher and scholar focused on Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Kurds, and geopolitics in the Middle East. Dr. Ghareeb has taught at Georgetown, George Washington University, the University of Virginia, Pepperdine, and McGill Universities. He is the author and co-author of 12 books and articles, with his writing focused on Iraq, Kurds, media coverage, and the information technology revolution in the Arab world, and US foreign policy. Dr. Ghareeb is a contributing analyst for the Associated Press and is one of the most widely interviewed experts on topics related to the Middle East. He has been a regular commentator for the BBC, for both radio and TV, Al Jazeera, and France 24. Dr. Ghareeb, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Of course. We can start today by asking how you got interested in working on the Middle East.
I guess just coming from the Middle East was a factor, but to tell you the truth, I was not in the beginning very much interested in politics and didn't know much about it actually until I came here. But it happened that when I came here very young, and it was at the time when you had the civil rights movements, you had the war in Vietnam, and that's when I started college actually. And we began to became involved in student newspaper, and that's slowly how I became interested in politics actually. And ultimately I majored in political science and later in history, focusing on the Middle East from Georgetown. That's where I got my MA and my PhD, and interested in interest in the Kurds. Actually, I was looking for a topic to write my thesis on. I thought of two topics. One was about the situation in the Sudan, the southern Sudan. The other was about the war in Yemen after the Yemen revolution of in the early 60s. And it was very difficult. I found out to get information. A friend suggested, why don't you write about the Kurds? I didn't know much about the Kurds then, very little. But I started digging. I wrote a paper, and then I later wrote my thesis, MA thesis, and I wrote later even a PhD dissertation, and both ultimately turned to books, one in Arabic and one in English. One was about the Kurdish nationalist movement, and the other about the Kurdish question specifically in Iraq. Yes, I talked a little bit about the Kurds in the neighboring countries, but that was focusing mostly on Iraq and autonomy that was given to the Kurds in 1970. So that's how I became interested. Media interests were, I started when I took some time off after finishing, before starting graduate school, went to Lebanon. And I worked for a newspaper there for Al Hayat and the Daily Star, actually, mostly the Daily Star newspaper, and then for the Journal of Palestine Studies. And that got me more and more interested in journalism. Ultimately, I did a book on how the American media covers the Middle East and the problems. Why is it that they don't cover it very fairly? And then another side interest is the major press, immigration from Lebanon and Syria to the United States. And I have a little bit of interest as well in Latin America, although I can't speak Spanish or Portuguese, but my main interest is in the immigration to the US. So that was another reason why I'm interested in that. This is just a little bit to give you a taste of where I come from or what my interests are.
Sounds amazing. That's very interesting. Yeah, I hope we can probably delve a little bit deeper later on, but I did want to switch gears and I guess start with the main topic of this discussion. Really, what if you could you briefly explain, sanctions, and sanctions, I think specifically used as a tool for U.S. Foreign policy?
This is a very good question, because this is increasingly the United States in the last 3-4 decades has begun to use sanctions, as you pointed out, as a weapon, in fact, against opponents, whether it is sometimes individuals, companies, but usually it's against countries, against regimes that are considered hostile to the United States or to some of its allies. And sanctions are seen as a weapon. It's a sharp weapon, but it's believed that this weapon will ultimately, the use of the sanctions, and of course they vary from country to country, and they are harder, tougher against some countries than they are against others. Nevertheless, what we have seen is that, generally speaking, these sanctions have not been very effective. And actually, sanctions in general have not been effective in bringing about the overthrow of regimes targeted by the United States. And they have not succeeded in many places in changing the policies or the positions of the governments involved. Nevertheless, it's been the people who pay the price. It's the people, always the poor, the middle class, who are hurt the most by these sanctions, and they can be devastating, actually. In fact, I appeared one time on a program with who testified before Congress with an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, who was responsible for the food for oil program and dealing with the sanctions on Iraq. And he called what happened in Iraq, for example. He said that probably the most effective, the most accurate term to use was genocide, because of hundreds of thousands of kids alone, 500,000 children. You remember, I think some of you may remember that, what Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, said when she was interviewed, I think it was on CBS it may have been 60 Minutes program, where the interviewer asked her, do you think that we know that there have been about 500,000 children who died in Iraq? Was the price worth it? And her answer was, yes, it's worth it. And so it's, it's the weak, it's the poor who end up paying the price. It's not the government. So what we're seeing, that's what we're seeing, in fact, in Syria. We saw it in Lebanon, we saw it in Iraq. I mean, it's the people who are paying the price. Recently, a conference that was organized by some church groups, and they were talking about this issue. And there was a Syriac bishop, archbishop, the archbishop of the Syriac church. I think he's based somewhere in New Jersey, and he was talking about how children are really the ones who are being affected in Syria. He said many children he said they are suffering disease, hunger to a certain extent, and this is going to be extremely damaging for children. And he said he appealed to the people in the conference to try to do something to stop this and to help the people receive aid. He said even though humanitarian assistance, food, medicine is allowed, but it's so complicated, in fact, that it's, and some companies also are worried about the consequences, so they just stay away from this. And so it's beginning to have it's not only beginning, it's been having an effect. And we saw, in fact, also, almost a third, some people say almost half of the Syrian population leaving the country. That's another. I mean, of course, the war was a factor, but I think sanctions were also very powerful weapons.
Yeah, they're leaving more often. More young people are just leaving the country because of it. You thought that was happening because of the war, but when the economy just downturned, it was terrible. More people left.
Exactly. I mean, it's people are affected. I've talked to a number of Syrians. I talked to Lebanese, by the way, as well. Now, many Lebanese are like I've heard thousands of nurses have left the country within the last year. Some going to Dubai, and many going to Western Europe, Belgium, France, Holland. They are taking them because they can speak. Many of them speak French as well as Arabic. Many of them are trained, and they just want them. They said they are going to give them, citizenships as well. The doctors, huge number of doctors are leaving Syria. Many doctors left. Many, of the skilled workers have left the country, and that's devastating when you think of it. But has it really changed the policies of the government? It has not changed the policies of the government. Has it, really brought about any kind of changes that are going to make a difference from the perspective, at least of those who are applying the sanctions? We, at least as you know that as well as I do. I'm sure you are in more contact also with a lot of people who have family, friends, etc. And it's the average people who are affected. It's not usually the regime or the people around it as much, and it's the poorest of the poor who pay the price. And that's why I think there's a need to bring about changes that are taking place. I was taking a look today before you're talking. There's this report by the United Nations which was talking about this issue. They were saying talking about the humanitarian impact of this Syria related unilateral restrictive measures, they call them. It outlines the complex network of non-UN economic sanctions, primarily set out by the European Union and the United States. There are several other countries that are also involved in the sanctions. They said EU sanctions restrict the types of financial services that EU banks can offer in Syria, as well as the types of goods that can be exported to Syria. The US imposes a blanket export embargo and broader financial restrictions. They say there is no consensus of opinion on whether the use of such unilateral, coercive economic measures are achieving their desired impact. They continue saying that although both sanctions regimes, that means European and the US, make exceptions to permit humanitarian work, the study notes, quote, that the practical application of navigating these permissions, when combined with wider regulatory risks, can at times be far removed from the policy commitment of limiting the impact on the local civilian population and those carrying out legitimate activities, close quote. The requirements are difficult to understand, often require legal analysis, and impede the rapid delivery of aid. As a result, they have created immense hurdles, quote here, immense hurdles of those engaged in delivering immediate humanitarian aid and wider stabilizing programs. They are saying that non-governmental organizations have reported an inability to process funds through the formal financial sector into Syria, as there are minimal unsanctioned banking channels are available to those delivering humanitarian aid. This prevents groups from paying local staff and suppliers and operating programs. In an effort to work around these problems, aid groups are increasingly transmitting funds via remittance and informal payment channels, creating greater risk. The report also notes the reluctance among Western banks to offer services for fear of sanctions violations. So you can see how that is affecting, even humanitarian and non-governmental organization, and even the UN sometimes, of trying to provide aid to the population on the ground, to those who are really need the aid so much more than almost anyone else.
It's clear that the sanctions have a negative impact on people in all of Syria, and it's not really hurting the regime as much as the United States had anticipated or hoped for. But we'd like to focus on the two different areas, Idlib and Turkish-controlled areas, and also what's being called AANES, the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria, and how the impacts of sanctions are different in these two areas than the rest of Syria. So Rojava, or the AANES, is what is being explained by some as an experiment with self-government. So just to explain to the viewers, the area became a de facto autonomous region in 2013 and 14, and is a confederacy of sorts of the regions of Afrin, Jazeera, the Euphrates, Raqqa, Tabaqa, Minbij, and Deir ez-Zor. So when the Caesar Act was first enacted, the United States had promised that the areas of Northeast Syria in this specific region wouldn't be included under the sanctions. But because the area still uses the Syrian pound, that hasn't been the case. So as an expert on the Kurds, could you explain a little more about the area and its path to self-government to start?
Well, basically what's happening in that area, I mean, the US has, as you know, we all know, has a presence there. The US has an interest in being there. Basically, originally, the justification, although in the beginning, I remember during a debate, some of you, maybe you may have watched it, some of you maybe were too young to do that, when there was a debate between Senator Obama at that time and Senator Romney during the presidential campaign of 2000, around 2012 or thereabouts. Or there was and Romney wanted to adopt a very tough position to opposing sanctions, even intervening militarily. And so Obama responded by saying that they are bringing back the policies of the 80s. Welcome back, which what he was talking about, that the policy of intervention, the policy of economic of sanctions, of pressures. But when Obama came into the White House, actually, especially in his second term, we began to see the rise of the neoliberal influences within his administration. And so what he ended up doing, he intervened in Libya. Again, but some of it was partly because of some of the Europeans wanted it, part of it because he was convinced that there was really a genocide taking place. And some of it was for economic interests, clearly the importance of Libya. Also, there was pressure from Congress as well. There was a decision to intervene in Syria, become involved and they relied on the authorization to fight terrorism in 2001, and the authorization which was 2001 was used, and then new authorization as well to invade Iraq, to fight terrorism, for weapons of mass destruction, et cetera, all of that. And so they used that to justify going into Syria. I mean, the reality was this: they considered the regime hostile to American interests and to Israel, and so ultimately the U.S., even we saw the American ambassador, something very unusual, participate in demonstrations taking place. That's usually ambassadors never do that, anything like that. So there was a change in the policy. What I'm saying is that there was, and they needed the Kurds at that time, who had begun to organize in that area, I would say going back to the 70s, late and early 80s. But what's interesting about also this area as well is that these are, I don't know if you know that, how many of you may, I don't know how much you know about the Kurds in Syria. The Kurds in Syria are not one group in a way. There are Kurds who have been there since the time of Salah ad-Din. and they know that they are of Kurdish descent. Of course, they intermarried with the Syrians, with Arabs, etc. And so there's a lot of mixture, but some still retain that. Then there were those who came with the Ottomans, and these were all usually military officers. They were, some of them later on stayed, became feudal lords. Actually, I remember when one time I went with my father. I was maybe about 10 or 11 years old, went to a town, small village in Syria near the border between Lebanon and Syria called Kfar Yabous. I don't know if any of you know that town. And as we walked through that town, what was interesting is that as you saw most houses were made of mud. And they were like 2 rooms. Sometimes there were 3, but usually 2 rooms. 1 room for some animals and room for the family. Then as we moved closer, we saw this big house, huge house made of stone and also an armid, you had, and so I was surprised, and I was asked my father, what's this? Why is this house so different? And why is it the only one after? He said, "This is the man that and that was the house that we were going to," because my father knew that. I don't know what it was. He was visiting him for. Anyway, he said that he owns all the land of the village and of 2 other villages as well. And the farmers are sharecroppers, really. They get paid by the crops, and they have their own animals, and they own their own huts, and that was it. So there were a number of these people. But then there is a 3rd group, and this is the group that's most interesting and most relevant for what's going on in Syria. And these are Kurds who, you began after. I'll go a little bit into history maybe here. The Kurds were late to the concept of nationalism. Later, they came to the idea of nationalism later than the Arabs, the Persians, or the Turks. And there was around 1880, 81, there was an uprising by a man by the name of Sheikh Ubaidullah al-Nahri. He was on the border area between Iraq, what's now Iraq, and Iran. He was part of the Ottoman Empire and part of the Persian Empire. He raised an army of 75,000 people and rebelled against the Ottoman government at that time, and to a certain extent, the Persian government. Even though those 2 governments didn't see eye to eye, didn't like each other very much, they cooperated against him. And ultimately, after around 81, 82, they almost crushed him. He was arrested, captured, exiled to Mecca. He was also the sheikh of the Naqshbandi Sufi order. But what was interesting about him is he is the first prominent Kurdish figure to say that we are a different people than the Persians and the Turks, and then the Armenians, and the Arabs. We are a nation of, that's separate from all of these, and we ought to have our own government. He sent a letter to the Tsar of Russia asking for help, and to the British ambassador in Istanbul asking for help. And of course, he wasn't helped. And after the armies of the 2 empires, were pushing him, and many of his followers, left him. They didn't join him because they were Kurdish nationalists. They followed him because he was a religious leader, and he was a sheikh as well, a tribal leader as well as the religious leader. So they didn't believe in nationalism. But after the First World War, when there were a small group of Kurds who demanded the recognition of Kurdish nationalism, and the Kurds should have a state of their own. And so the Treaty of Sevres between the Ottoman Empire and the allies, the successful allies, agreed that the Kurds and the Armenians have the right to establish their own states if they want those states and if they are capable of ruling those states. But a couple of years later, Ataturk succeeded in getting rid of the foreign forces from Turkey, established a Turkish state, and in 1923, he renegotiated the Sevres Agreement with the allies and in Lausanne, Treaty of Lausanne, and there was not one single word about Kurdish state or Kurdish entity established. In 1925, a new sheikh, also a Sufi religious leader, Sheikh Saeed al-Birani, launched a revolt against Turkey. The Turkish government took a year. He was crushed, was executed with a large number of his followers. But what was interesting about him is that you're beginning to see here the separation between nationalism and religion. He, first of all, what did he complain about? He said, this man, Ataturk, abolished the Sufi orders. And this is, how could he do that? He said he abolished the caliphate. We as Muslims, we have had a caliph since the death of the Prophet. How could he abolish the caliphate? He said that he abolished replaced the Arabic letters, the letters of the Quran with European letters for the Turkish language. He almost said this is an act of an infidel. And then he said, where did his Kurdish nationalism come through? He said, for the Kurdish provinces, there should be a Kurdish governor or someone who knows Kurdish. His deputy should be someone either a Kurd or speaks Kurdish. He said the government should give back to the Kurdish provinces some of the money that is taken for taxes. He said the courts should have judges who are Kurds who speak Kurdish, and because many Kurds, he said, don't speak Turkish. So basically that was the beginning of, so his movement was crushed, but then there was a more nationalist movement revolt in 1927 by the Khoybun, an organization that started. And then between that and around 1938, there was something like close to 1920 uprisings in Turkey, small and large. And about 1 million people were forced, either fled or were forced out of their regions, and a large number of them ended up in Syria. So these were Kurdish Turks who ended up in Syria, and that's why you had the issue of many of them were not given Syrian citizenships for a while. And so that was a problem. And then there was a leftist movement that began to rise among these people, and also at the same time in Turkey as well, that Abdullah Öcalan was involved with. And later, Abdullah Öcalan established with a small group of students, the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party. And that, we know where it went. It's a very powerful organization, still challenging the Turkish state up until now. There are fierce battles. And in fact, something that's many people don't realize, at least there are about 5,000 to 6,000 Syrian Kurdish fighters. At one time, by the way, in the early period, this group was combined, had some Arabs with them as well. They were leftists, but then later they sort of separated and focused mostly on Kurds. But there are about, like now in Iraq with the main Kurdish force and others, there are about at least a third of the force are Syrian Kurds. And 4 of the members of the Politburo of the PKK basically are Syrians, and they play major roles, Syrian Kurds. So, and that's why you have this relationship, strong tie. Now, what puts the US in a very difficult position is that on the one hand, Turkey is an ally, a NATO ally, an important country. And by the way, I don't know how many of you, did you hear about that Senator Graham now is going to the region? He's going to meet with the leaders in Syria.
Oh, yes.
He's going he wants to bring the Turks and the Kurds together, to start working closely together, and that would make it much easier. There's oil, Turkey needs oil. There's oil in the region that the Kurds control. There are also, they don't need grain, but there are also, that would make an addition because these are rich agricultural lands, and the US would support them, and so they should, and therefore it's important to try to bring Turkey and the Kurds together. And so that's one of the main parts of his purposes of his visit to the area. So what's happening yet, and however, the region has fared a little better. There was smuggling taking place. Oil was being smuggled, grain was being smuggled. But I read an article recently, actually, that there was a big complaint that many of the farmers were not allowed to sell grain to the rest of Syria, and the part under the regime's control. But at one time they were selling them to Iraq, and some of the oil went through Iraq to Turkey and was re-exported, and some of the oil was also went to the Syrian government. So I mean, there were trade deals that were being done. So there was, at least economically, and there was U.S. support, financial. So at least slightly better than the other areas. The aid to the other regions, like to Idlib, and well, of course, Turkey there has participated. The UN, because at one time there was 4 entry points, so it was much easier. Nevertheless, the people there are facing also a very difficult situation. And now we've been hearing about Erdogan trying maybe launch. There have been some fierce attacks taking place back and forth, but apparently the Turks have used recently heavy artillery and tanks, and so I wonder if they're really going to push through. But the point is that they want to resettle some of the refugees in that area, and some people believe they want to annex also, some of that area, as they did with Alexandretta many years ago, 1939. But it's still not clear. The problem is that they have to be very careful. The Russians have taken a sort of somewhat a tougher line on this position of the Turkish invasion, but who knows how it's going to. It's difficult to say what direction it's going to go into right now.
I would like to focus on the second area, which is Idlib, which is also very complicated. For the viewers, this is an area in northwest Syria which uses the Turkish lira, but has been described as the last rebel stronghold in Syria. So I'd like to know how you would describe the area, and could you also give an explanation of how Idlib has changed during the war and in the aftermath of it with sanctions and just overall?
Well, there's no doubt that the sanctions have affected everybody. Nevertheless, at least there was an opening to Turkey in a way, and that made it a little bit easier. There were even some trade, despite with the Kurds, with the Qasad. There have been trade back and forth, and that also mitigated the circumstances. But a large number of people who were not part of that region also had fled to that region. You have a number of different militias and different organizations, but it's really under Turkish control for all intents and purposes. And that has made it easier, but it was easier when you had more entry points. And now there are inside Turkey, apparently there is an anti-Syrian movement, anti-Syrian refugee tide that's beginning to rise and critical, of this policy, in a way, of Turkey becoming involved and opening its doors. Although at one time there were reports that Turkey might give citizenship to those Syrians who entered, or to at least large numbers of them, but there was sort of a reaction to it among the Turkish population, and that in fact may have strengthened the opposition to Erdogan. So this is affecting that region, but it's the change in the demographics also has been a factor, and there's a little bit of tension between the local original population. That's what I've heard. I don't know how accurate that is, but that I've heard from you. You might have some information on this, and then the refugees who came to that area, or those who were part of families of members of the different organizations of militias, whatever, that were in the region. And so all of this is, makes it, as you say in Arabic, على كف عفريت, in a sense. A lot depends on how things are going to evolve in the country. On the one hand, I mean, the Syrian government in Damascus has been able to regain control of large parts of Syria again, but the price has been also very, very high there, and there are a lot of problems, and the sanctions certainly are not helping. Nevertheless, there is this. Some people are saying, well, maybe the people should be. The regime has been saying, let people go back to their original home. So, but how realistic is that now? Unless there is some kind of a settlement, it's still difficult to see. So I think it's a very complex situation that we're seeing on the ground in that area. And part of it, a lot was going to depend really what happens in terms, will Turkey really invade? How are the Kurds and the Syrians regime, are they going to be able to reach some kind of a sort of a, I don't want to call it alliance, but at least cooperation to work together, because both see a threat from the Turkish army and the Turkish state. And I hear there have been some contacts. In fact, if you've been listening to some statements coming from the Kurdish leaders, they're sort of being, sort of more flexible. Although they're saying that the Damascus is not taking into our demands into account, that is still, nevertheless, there's more. At least I think some people have been talking that there's communication going on, and the government in that area, or the Majlis in that area, is asking for the Syrian government to send its troops to the area. Now, but the government also has its own demands. And so that's what makes it still a little bit complicated.
Obviously, recently, Lebanon's economy has been plagued by many crises. They had the liquidation crisis in 2019, the fall of the exchange rate, and obviously the massive inflation and the inability of people just to access their money from the banks. Could you briefly explain what's going on in Lebanon and that economic crisis?
Well, Lebanon is a mess, to put it mildly. I mean, in a way, you have a very corrupt establishment, very corrupt, almost, and this is trans-sectarian, crosses all sects, all religions. I mean, they have been. What they've been doing is the government has been living on Lebanon used to have a lot of the banking system was a very, very strong system. And you had many governments, Arab governments, used to use Lebanese banks. The Syrian government used them all along, before, all the way going back, and others as well. And then the expatriates, they put some of them put their money there because they were getting higher interest. But what was happening in reality is that the government was taking money out and using it to spend for the salaries, for whatever they needed, and ultimately almost bankrupted the central bank. I mean, and they bankrupted the people who had invested there. Many people I know. I was talking with a friend of mine who is a former Lebanese ambassador. He said, he had put his money in one of the banks of Lebanon, and he was hoping to get $4,000 every month. And he thought that this $4,000 is very good money to live in Lebanon. He said now he gets only $200 because of the inflation. What happened from the lira to I think he said he's still better than a lot of other people from his perspective. One interesting thing that has been happening is, like, there's been a trend towards normalization between some Arab countries and Damascus to bring. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this Arab summit in Algiers. That's going to the Arab League summit. That's going to take place in Algeria. The Algerians have been supportive of bringing Syria back to the Arab League. If that takes place, I think that will bring, and now there is some pressure also, from what I understand, on the US government in terms of Lebanon, because of what's going on in the south as well, these three drones that Hezbollah sent over the south. The US is trying to support certain parties that are critical of Hezbollah in Lebanon, so they might be willing to provide some assistance to the government. If that happens, then you could see some changes. But how significant is it going to be? And then you have that deal that was supposed to take place that was opposed in the beginning by members of Congress, a number of the deal between Egypt, Jordan. Basically, I think what the U.S. has been putting pressure. For example, even the UAE criticized the U.S. They said the U.S. has been putting pressure on them not to send aid to normalize with Damascus. One of the things that there was this conference that I was telling you about that took place. This is some religious organization. That's where that bishop spoke. And there was one of the speakers, one of the people who participated was somebody by the name of who's very much involved with some of the aid in his European and trying different non-governmental organizations. So he's talking about the problems that they face. And I thought that because this applies, I think, everywhere. He said that there's the organization called Aid to Church in Need. Said it has called on the United States and the European Union to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to the heavily sanctioned country. It's our duty to provide help to the suffering civil population of Syria. And in their name, I beg you to implement the existing international legal framework, which allows humanitarian exceptions to the embargo. The legal exemptions included in the sanctions regime currently imposed upon Syria cannot be utilized fully. Obstacles hindering money transfers, and this, by the way, applies also in Lebanon, and the import of humanitarian goods render any form of assistance impossible. Although the sanctions foresee exceptions for money transfers related to humanitarian help, the mechanism does not work. He says that the European IBAN and the American SWIFT banking codes block transfers bearing any reference to Syria and any city within the country. Consequently, it becomes almost impossible for charitable organizations to transfer funds for humanitarian purposes to meet the needs of the suffering population. That money transfers are of vital importance because the different institutions, including church institutions, including non-governmental organizations, do not themselves have the capacity to ship the goods needed for survival of almost 14 million Syrians in need of help. So he was basically, there is a need for an urgent, even if interim solution in the beginning to this problem, and then to try to find a solution to it. And I think this is, it's important here if there are a number of the non-governmental organizations here and other places, activists maybe use their influence to work together to put pressure to allow that to change this mechanism. Even something like you were saying, even when there are exemptions for humanitarian aid, you cannot really get that aid there.
Yeah,
Exactly. You may know about that. I don't know if you've done anything in this area or if you faced any problems or if you know of any organizations that have done this.
Yeah, clearly there's a lot of backlash to the sanctions today, and there's a pattern of normalization with other countries, like you've said, and all these conferences. So I think that it's obvious from the world's point of view that these sanctions that the United States are imposing simply don't have the intended effect, and they're just hurting the Syrian.
Right, and especially that money transfer aspect. I mean, that's a huge issue, and I think it's something that if we could mobilize effectively, then I think it's something that members of Congress could really look at and at least make some exceptions on, because that's the biggest issue. That's even though you put all those exemptions for humanitarian aid, nothing can really happen, because what's so key, something that we just take for granted every day, is the ability to exchange money, and they can't do it.
And also, apparently, I also have read someplace and I've heard it as well, that banks in the United States or in Europe or other are afraid to do it. They just don't want to get on the wrong side of the government and of the sanctions, because this might pose problems for them that they don't need, basically. So they prefer to avoid it by not participating, by not helping in this. So maybe that's another area where maybe some at least sort of some effort be made to put pressure on some of these members of Congress to try to take that into account. Although I don't know, some of them probably it's a hopeless case, but some I think there are changes taking place, as I'm sure you know, in the U.S. itself. Where I mean, we're seeing the composition. We saw the composition of the last Congress when it came to some of these issues.
Yeah. And I think a big part of it is education within our own community, education also with those that supported the sanctions as well, because I think that if an honest conversation is had about what the actual implications are of the current regime in practice and how that's affecting people, I think a more rich conversation can happen where we can talk about specifics and address a lot of these underlying issues. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. But before we go, we'd like to see if you had any last things you'd like to discuss or just any closing remarks.
Well, I'm going to first of all, I want to thank you for the invite. It was a pleasure being with you, and I think it's important to one of the things is to try to build bridges towards other Arab, first of all, Arab American organizations. I think that would be very important on your and to try to work with them and bring them together. I think that, and then reach out to other communities. You cannot just I mean, I don't know how strong the community is. I mean, there are some areas where they are very, very active and very involved, but in other areas they're either demoralized, and there are also divisions within the community as well, as you know. And nevertheless, I think this may be an area or an issue where you could get support from all in terms of trying to provide at least economic assistance to basic humanitarian assistance, medicines. I mean, that's another thing. You have children who are going hungry, according to I read that. I wish I couldn't find it. I was looking for it. This Archbishop Kawak, his name, a Syriac Archbishop, and he's saying that this is affecting all Syrian children. We need to help all of them as much as we can. Apparently, that organization sent over the years something like $50 million to non-governmental organizations. That's significant. But that has been over almost like a decade in a sense, But still, if there are more people doing that and try to bring people together, I think that would be a great thing, because there is really a need. Otherwise, it's going to be, a catastrophe. I mean, we saw what happened with the effect of the sanctions, like Iraq was. I mean, the Iraqis, however, did something that was very interesting. That the situation had deteriorated so badly that ultimately the UN changed and they allowed the food for oil, although it wasn't even basic enough to provide enough food for the whole month. They gave monthly support, but the government, regardless of what you think of the regime at the time, I was watching watching a show the other day, interviewing Iraqis about how things are today, how they were before. And they were talking to this Shiite woman from the Sadr city. And they asked her what she thought. She said of the situation, she said, and what she thought of the regime, Saddam's regime compared to today. She said, that one of her sons died in prison and the other died in the war. And so she didn't think much of the regime. She was very hostile, very critical. But she said, when we started getting the oil for food, they would send a box every month to my house. It had some oil, it had some sugar, some flour, etc. Every month I got it. And I could, she said, the other thing is I could, then I could go from, visit my relatives, visit my neighbors at night after, at 6, 7, 8, 9 o'clock in the evening, and I felt secure, even though we were in a bad economic situation. She said, now after 6 o'clock, I don't leave my house anymore. And our economic situation is terrible. So I mean, it's sometimes, there is also need to maybe to get pressure on the different the authorities to try also to be more effective. But basically, the outside is how to get outside help to the through non-governmental organizations, through maybe religious institutions, if that works for some. That some of them do a good job, some don't, but that's something that at least and to work with other groups. I mean, I think that would be very worthwhile.
Yeah, and I think from that lady's story, what we hear is that we just wish that the countries in the Middle East can have effective governance and also strong economic growth. Yeah. And that's something that, I think that we all just really want for our people back home. So, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Ghareeb, for your time and a great conversation. I feel like I'm now a Kurdish expert after speaking with you. It was really fantastic. And I also want to thank our viewers for watching. To stay connected with Relieve Syria, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just search for our handle @Relieve Syria on Facebook and Twitter, and Relieve Syria, that's one word, on Instagram. Leave us a message, let us know your thoughts. We hope you all enjoyed this edition of our Fireside Chat, and have a wonderful day. Thanks again, Dr. Ghareeb. Thank you.